Drone technology has been a long-time interest to the Central Research and Development Organization of the Department of Defense, also known as DARPA. DARPA, alongside Electric Sky, have come together to explore ways to wirelessly charge drone swarms. CEO and co-founder of Electric Sky, Robert Millman, joins me to discuss the Whisper Beam and the future of faster, cleaner, quieter, and more economical travel. Join us as we get rebelliously curious. Robert, thank you so much for joining me on Rebelliously Curious today. You are the CEO and co-founder of a company called Electric Sky. So before we get into a whole bunch of wonderful things that are happening with the company and something called the Whisper Beam, which is really exciting, can you please tell me what is Electric Sky and what your mission is?
Yes, certainly. What we're trying to do is make flight faster, cleaner, cheaper. In other words, all of us come from an aerospace background. We're trying to move people around the planet quicker in a more sustainable way and a way that doesn't cost. Right now, trying to fly at high speed can cost, twice as much to 10 times as much. We're trying to knock that down. And electricity for us is the answer to doing so.
That's awesome. So you're working on a project called the Whisper Beam, and I believe this is attached to DARPA. Can you explain to us a little bit about what the Whisper Beam is?
Sure, but we're going to go pretty deep into the weeds here, if it's
That's okay.
okay.
That sounds good to me.
Uh, what we're looking at is transmitting power up to a flight vehicle. So that right away, that tells you, well, wait a second, haven't people been talking about transferring power for, 100 years, 120 years, going back to Tesla? Um, and we looked at the first principles of that and said, on first principles, it makes sense. When you carry fuel, you carry a lot of weight with you on board that vehicle. And an aircraft taking off, it might be 40% fuel at takeoff, fuel weight. That's almost half the weight of the aircraft is fuel. That means you have a lot of structure that's holding all that, the tanks, the pumps, all that kind of thing. If you could take the fuel off of the aircraft, then you could move a lot faster, you could fly a lot higher, and you could fly, less expensively. So now we were pretty reluctant to go down the road of wireless power up to an aircraft. That's long distance. Wireless power has this kind of let's say, mixed history of way too much overpromising by people in the past. So we decided we had to look at the underlying physics, and since the technology itself has been around for over 100 years, we had to come up with a new method of transmitting power over long distances. And the Whisper Beam is the culmination of that effort. So now here, if you don't mind, a little technical translation, and tell me or ask questions along the way if you like.
Sounds good.
A standard transmission technique is it starts out really strong and condensed, and as it propagates, it gets wider and wider, which means it's gets thinner and spread out, and so it's getting weaker. The closer it gets to the receiver, the weaker it is. And that's called a Gaussian beam for reasons of the mathematics of it. But just the standard thing you're used to, if you look at anything from a laser pointer, when if you pointed a laser pointer, it's getting a little wider as it propagates. If you shot that thing all the way to the moon, it'd be quite wide. But other things work the same way. Microwave transmitters, if you wanted to transmit power by microwave. So these are all different wavelengths on the electromagnetic spectrum. You can do the same. The electromagnetic spectrum, let's say, it works on the same principles all across the spectrum. It's just the different wavelengths make different. We can see light, so we can see a laser. We can't see a microwave, but it's still there. What a whisper beam does is almost the opposite. It's quite counterintuitive to what you think of when you think of a beam. It starts out really weak, and it gets even weaker as it propagates, and then it comes back to a point at the receiver. So it's actually weaker between the transmitter and the receiver. It gets weak and then gets strong again at the receiver. So we can put power on a moving aircraft without putting a lot of power on anything in between. So birds and other things can fly through, or other aircraft. Now, when I say counterintuitive, we just don't have anything in our everyday life that looks like that kind of a thing. What's happening is, on a regular Gaussian beam that everyone's used to, it's called diffraction is what's spreading the beam. In layman's terms, a physicist might object to this, but in layman's terms, we're kind of tricking diffraction into focusing the beam instead of dispersing it. So how's that for,
That's amazing.
it's technical, that's mathematical. I am not the inventor of it, but we'll all be beneficiaries of the technology.
No, it's wonderful. And so right now you're using drones and drone technology with, I believe, this type of beam technology with the whisper beam. Are you going to be looking to use it in larger aircrafts? I believe you said that, but how close are we to something like that? Do we use drones first and then we move into something that's larger?
So we are working on drones. We haven't yet transmitted it to a moving aircraft. That will require that will require some techniques that are common in the communications world, have been around for, let's say, decades. We just have not reached that point in our development process. Our let's say, methodology is to start with the hardest problems and leave the easier solved problems for the later stages of the development program. And at the stage we're at, we are working on forming this new beam. First, we did a lot of computer modeling of the beam transmission. To form this beam, what we need to do is create an array. So an array is a bunch of individual transmission elements. If you think of either a radar array or a solar array collects a lot of solar power, but it's thousands of little individual elements that are collecting all that power. We're doing the opposite. We have thousands of little elements that are transmitting power, but to form that architecture, that new waveform, we have to phase each of the different elements uniquely. So they together collectively form this pattern that interferes with itself in such a way that it self-focuses. My apologies if
No.
too much physics here.
No, it's great. It's wonderful.
At any rate, what we spent the first part of our development was just, can these beams be made? And we started with computer simulations, and we used different software from other, that are used in the communications world, and said, okay, yes, they can be done. And what DARPA funded was building the world's first physical transmitter, where we built, this is a lab bench transmitter, so it's transmitting power just about 3 meters, roughly 3 yards. And our goal was just to build the physical instrument and check the measurements against our computer simulations. And so the good news is they match perfectly, so it does behave exactly as it was simulated. That's not a surprise, but you always want to confirm things like that. When you have a model, models are simplifications, you want to confirm that your model matches reality. And that's what we were doing on the DARPA program.
So I believe that they granted you, I think it was 225,000 to do this research. So it was in a smaller scale. When do you move to a larger scale? Like when will DARPA say this is something that we want to apply in our drone technology or even just our aircrafts moving forward?
We are, I don't have a date for you. It will take 18 months to, let's say, 26 months to do that effort. We are working on the design of it now and working on some funding sources for it. It'll be a bigger unit that we will have to build. And there are just certain things that costs that come with it. They're one-time costs, but I'll give you an example. You remember I said that there were thousands of individual cells. We'll have to build a little specialized chip into each cell. So that means designing the chip, going to a foundry, getting the foundry to produce the chip. Once you've incurred all that expense, it's very cheap to turn out thousands of units, but the upfront costs are rather high. So that's what we're working on now, is raising the money for that and designing those things. And we also will have a receiver that the receiver takes that. This is going to be, we're working right now at radio frequencies. And so the receiver is just a panel that absorbs those radio waves and rectifies or turns them into electricity. And so that receiving antenna that also rectifies, the shorthand in the biz is called a rectenna. And we're working predominantly on the design of the rectenna next, and then we'll be doing the transmitter.
Are there any competitors right now in the field, or are you guys the first to market?
Um, there are always competitors out there. I don't know of anyone who is working on this particular technology. This technology is patented. And most other people have been working with conventional Gaussian techniques, like shooting a laser up to a UAV, or there have been some experiments over the years, really since the 1960s, where people were doing experiments with microwaves. You might mount a microwave to the top of a truck and have a drone fly over it. Because we're working with a whole different wave architecture, we're kind of starting from scratch in terms of building the apparatus.
And you partnering with any other companies outside of DARPA doing this? And if so,
So
who might these
far, we're
be?
doing
Yeah.
this all on our own. As we
Awesome.
expand, we will be working with others. So, for example, there is an electric aircraft industry that is trying to be born. And electricity, let's say to go off on a little bit of a tangent, electricity is a marvelous form of energy in so many ways. It's clean, it's efficient. You can throttle it easy. In other words, you can regulate how much there is. It's almost the perfect form of energy in every way except for one. And that one thing is it does not store very well. Batteries are really heavy, compared to, let's say, petroleum. And petroleum's kind of the inverse of electricity. Petroleum is a lousy form of energy in many ways. It's dirty, it's loud. The engines that run it need a lot of combustion. I mean, need a lot of maintenance. So it's lousy in every way except for one. It stores really well. You can put a lot of energy in a gas tank. The equivalent amount of batteries would weigh, so much more. It might weigh 20 times more. And so electrifying things is hard. Well, electrifying flight vehicles is particularly hard, which is what drove us to look at wireless power, even though it doesn't have a great history so far. Most other people we know of that are working in electrification are working, if they're transmitting power, they're looking at standard Gaussian techniques. But most of the vehicles out there are trying to figure out how can they store as much power as possible on the vehicle, whether it's an electric aircraft or it might be a hydrogen aircraft that uses a fuel cell, and the fuel cell generates electricity to turn the rotors. No matter what let's say, their architecture is, transmitting power up to the aircraft can be helpful for them. So if you're, let's say, you're a hydrogen aircraft, um, some of the downsides or inconveniences of hydrogen is it's really bulky and you have to store it kind of in one place. Petroleum's nice. You can put it out in tanks in the wings that otherwise that space wouldn't be used. Whereas hydrogen, if you wanted liquid hydrogen, it would boil off too quickly. So you have to put it in the main fuselage. And it's big and it's bulky, so it's going to crowd out your passengers. So it can be done, but it's hard. What we could do is if we transmitted energy to the vehicle, let's say just during takeoff and climb. So if we had arrays that were at the airport, so that the aircraft, as it's taking off, climb is the most power hungry phase of flight, for a horizontal aircraft anyway. And if we were giving them external power, now they don't need to carry as much hydrogen on board, or they can carry more, they can go further and carry more people further. But it's all to the good. The economics of the aircraft all improve. And so breaking through to zero emission electric flight, there are a variety of technologies. The nice thing about the whisper beam technology is it can supplement all of the other technologies, whether it's battery electric, hydrogen fuel cells, or what's called a hybrid electric, where they use a petroleum power generator that's, generates electricity. All of those things can reduce emissions. Some can go to zero emissions, and whisper beams can help them all.
Yeah, it's amazing. I was just going to ask you about climate because we obviously have a climate problem right now and we're looking at climate change. So the whisper beam would be something that would hopefully combat that and lower emissions. Do you
Yes.
guys have an actual kind of number over the course of years that how much, emissions would lower by using the whisper beam, even in just larger crafts potentially when we get
I,
to that phase?
I don't have one offhand, but I can. Right now, if you look at global emissions of CO2 or its equivalent, um, um, commercial aircraft in general, I think are in about the 4 to 5% range. But what's projected in the future is everything else goes down and gets better in the future through efforts to reduce CO2 emissions. The one outlier is aerospace. Aircraft are really hard to reduce those emissions because they need really light energy source, and petroleum is a light energy source, a lightweight. And so I would say that aerospace's big problem is its percentage of the global CO2 emissions just keeps growing in the future. Everyone else is getting better, aircraft not so much. And aircraft come with, let's say, additional problems that other fossil fuel users don't generate. So aircraft generate contrails. In other words, if you see a jet going across the sky, you'll see that white cloud behind them. That's the contrail. So what's happening is it's condensing water vapor into crystals and forming a cloud. The problem is those clouds there's a consensus that those contrails are contributing to global warming. They actually have a mixed effect. They reflect some sunlight during the day, so they reduce global warming, and they hold like a blanket holding it at night, which increases global warming. But the consensus among most scientists is, on the whole, they contribute to global warming, and their numbers can be staggering. They can be, the widest consensus is that contrails alone might be 30 to 40% of CO2 emissions. In other words, if you look at the net warming that comes from CO2, contrails would be a third or more as much on top of that. So aircraft have a big environmental problem that is harder to solve than vehicles that are running around here on the ground. Yeah.
Have you thought about working in aerospace? You did mention that. And if so, what would that look like in the future?
Well, we are working in aerospace. I will tell you that our our intuition of what is aerospace is kind of limited by combustion engines, fossil fuel combustion. Because we've been relying on combustion for the last 100 years or so, we've developed what, in retrospect, is kind of a weird intuition. If you think of jet planes fly in the lower atmosphere, below, let's say, well, below 60,000 feet, which is about 18 kilometers. But most of them fly below 40,000 feet. I think that's in the range of 12 kilometers. That's down in the thickest part of the atmosphere. And the reason they fly at that level is because the engine needs the oxygen to maintain combustion. If that, in other words, the aerodynamicists would be happy to fly at higher altitude, let's say above 100,000 feet, above 30 kilometers. But the engines won't operate up there. They can't get enough oxygen to keep going. So they have to fly down in the thick part of the atmosphere where there's more drag, it's more expensive. So one of the outcomes of that is we fly really slowly today. If you wanted to go, let's say you're on the East Coast of the United States, if you wanted to go to Paris, that's a 6 or 8 hour flight. LA to London is a 10.5 hour flight. We stay below the speed of sound in part because we have to stay down in the lower atmosphere where the drag is so much higher. And yes, airplanes that fly faster can fly a little higher. So a supersonic aircraft might fly like Concorde. I think, if I recall right, Concorde flew at 60-ish thousand feet, 65,000 feet. That might be 18 to 19 kilometer altitude. But the aerodynamicists still wanted to go much higher, and Concorde had to stay down there in the lower atmosphere where there was a lot of drag. With electric propulsion, you're not limited to the lower atmosphere. So electric propulsion can fly higher. And there's an area of space where we aren't, or I shouldn't say space, an area of the atmosphere we're not really using much. Above 100,000 feet, above 30 kilometers, that is virtually unused except for rockets go quickly through before they exhaust themselves. On their way to space, they transit through. But for the most part, that's unused atmosphere right now. Electric propulsion can operate at those kinds of altitudes, which means it can operate faster, it'll be quieter, it'll be cleaner. So the future of flight is higher altitude, higher speed, and zero emissions. That's where we're headed. So when you say aerospace, most people think, well, that's either aviation, which is low altitude, or space, but nothing in between. We're working on the in between.
Yeah, that's really exciting because then it
Yes.
means, yeah, you're saying you can get to LA instead of from LA to New York, or sorry, LA to London, England in 10 hours. Would it be half the time? Like, do you have an idea of what that would look like?
We do have an idea. It's very preliminary. It's way
For
too
sure.
early. But I will say that I will tell you what our goals are. Our goals are to get travel at current ticket prices. And it may be that the way it pencils out is that a business class flight could take, let's say, under 2 hours, but it would come at a certain fare because of the energy used. And if you had the luxury of spending, let's say, 3 hours to get from LA to London, then it might be a lower fare, more like a premium economy fare. But those are aspirational goals right now. We do not have a vehicle that closes that does that. That's the kinds of things we are aiming for in our development program.
That's awesome. And I want to go back before we end this interview and just ask you too about the Whisper Beam. How will it change, military combat within larger crafts or even drones? Because right now, obviously, the drones are the focus, but DARPA is using that, I would say, probably for military uses, because that's what they do. How will that change combat in the future?
And so we're starting with drones. It's easier to start with aircraft that don't have any people on board. And then so you start with small drones over small distances. So the power levels are lower, and you can work out a lot of the challenges and the bugs involved. And then you scale to larger aircraft that carry passengers. And there's a regulatory burden that comes with passenger aircraft. It is not uncommon for a new power system like this to take 10 years just to get through the regulatory reviews. We can be working and developing that technology with the drones right out of the box. And so, of course, you'd expect the early discussions and the early media talk to be about drones. And that is what we are looking at, but we're looking at it with the eye towards where does this technology take us down the road? And down the road is cleaner travel for people at faster speeds.
Robert, thank you so much for joining me on Rebelliously Curious today. And I'm really looking forward to flying electric air in the future.
Thank you, Chrissy.